Welcome to episode 216, Ethical AI, Emerging Use of Artificial Intelligence for Documentation and Practice Management, featuring Dr. Maelisa McCaffrey, licensed psychologist. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Elizabeth Irias, and I am just delighted to be joined by my dear colleague, Dr. Maelisa McCaffrey. Maelisa has really made a name for herself in our industry as one of the clinical documentation experts. And she's joining us today for a conversation about the use of artificial intelligence in clinical practice. And I am just so excited to hear what she has to say. It is lovely to see you, Dr. McCaffrey. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's really, really great to see you, and I'm very excited to talk about this topic.
So, for our listeners who are not familiar with your work, will you please take a moment and share about yourself and how you became such a specialist in clinical documentation?
Sure. I started out in mental health agencies, the way many of us do, both in clinical work and then moved into quality assurance, and have had a few different roles in different companies. As far as quality assurance goes, and found that I really loved not reviewing records, but I loved training people. and also found that documentation is such a scary topic for so many clinicians. And the thing I heard most often after doing any training was, we never learned about this in grad school. And people were so appreciative of having any training they could get around documentation. So then I started asking my friends in private practice, like, hey, would this be interesting to you? Like, what if I, did some consulting or had a training for people who have private practice? And everyone encouraged me to do it. And that was 10 years ago. So the last 10 years, the rest is history. I have a business called QA Prep, where I train therapists on documentation. And one of my specialties, actually, aside from having trainings and a paperwork packet, is helping therapists catch up on paperwork. So through the experience of working with clinicians over these last 10 years, I've learned what an overwhelming and shameful experience it is to be behind in your notes and how common it is. So we do groups to help therapists catch up. And the most important part of it is the healing and self-compassion that happens through the groups and through literally showing up to a group and seeing 40 other people, virtually, who are dealing with the same thing as you are. So I always, no matter what the topic is, in any interview I'm doing, I always say, hey, if you're alone, there are many people listening to this right now who are behind in their paperwork, and you're not alone. There's help out there.
Thank you, Maelisa. And actually, that's kind of the perfect segue to a conversation about artificial intelligence, about AI, because as we record this in the middle of 2024, more and more information, targeted marketing toward therapists to use AI in clinical practice. And a lot of that, I think, comes down to trying to streamline our clinical documentation. So as we dive into this topic, why don't we just start with you giving us a quick 101. What is artificial intelligence, please?
Yeah, and I've had to learn because so many of my clients, like you said, are desperate for this information. Like, maybe AI will save the day.
Is it like a little green alien that we take out of a little box and put next to our keyboard and it taps away and writes our notes for us? Is that not it?
If only. That might actually be simpler. So AI encompasses many things, but we all use it and experience it every single day. And it's essentially computer learning, and it's not the same as human learning, but it is simulated human learning. And so AI can be very impressive and very powerful, but it is not the same as a human learning as far as nuance and emotion. But what that looks like in everyday life, probably one of the most basic things is texting and predictive text. So your phone learns the words that you use over time and how you speak. And you can both teach it to learn that, right? You can literally say, like, add this to my vocabulary, or it will just learn that through experience and through you using that phone over many months. So that's a really common, relatable thing that AI does. Other things that AI does is have conversations with you. So ChatGPT is really popular. Most of you listening have probably heard of ChatGPT and maybe used it. And you can literally log in to this system and type in a question, and it will talk to you, and it will continue the conversation, and it will ask you how well it gave you the information, if you need anything else. And it is actually just using information from the internet and information it's been given uh, to answer your questions, but it is smart enough to learn what might be a better answer, for example. So that's how it's different from Googling something, is that you can't necessarily tell Google, I don't like that answer, give me something better. But you could say that to ChatGPT and it will give you something different. And it might even be smart enough to say, what don't you like about that answer? Or how can I help you better? And then it will help you in a more conversational way get the information that you are looking for.
As we're having this conversation, AI for a number of years has been all over the news. Thank you for the 101 on AI. Where does this fit in then with clinical practice, with law and ethics?
Yeah, it's a brand new territory and it's very wild, wild west. So I have been doing reviews of all these AI services, not all these AI services, that's extremely broad, of AI tools built for therapists. Um, and to distinguish that, like you said, not AI that is doing therapy. We're talking today about AI tools that are built for therapists to use. So how does that play into ethics? It's totally new. And it's because it's new, it's changing dramatically. There's no one way to do it. There's no set standard. And it's like some of these companies are dramatically different than they were 6 months ago. I have a training I did on AI a year ago that now is very different. So even in that time frame, it's still shifting. For as far as ethics goes, our ethics codes across the board, right? No matter what type of licensed mental health therapist you are in the United States, give us some guidance on what to do in realms of new territory, right? So whether it is a new modality that's being introduced or being researched, none of our ethics codes say don't use it, don't do it, don't do anything new. But they give us guidance as far as, okay, if it's new, look at it a little differently than if it's established, and be careful about it. Get consultation on it, get training in it, understand it, and usually that whole proceed with caution thing, right? If we want to sum up this interview, it probably is those three words: proceed with caution. So you can proceed, just do so with caution. And a lot of our ethics codes took a long time to even talk about technology and things related to electronic health records. There are a lot of things that are fairly typical practice nowadays that 20 years ago we had very little guidance on. And it's the same with AI, and some of our codes are better about updating things more quickly than others. I'm a psychologist. APA is pretty slow on purpose, I think. So they like to see what's going to happen with something before they're going to give specific guidance on it. Whereas AMHCA has already outlined what to do about AI very specifically in their code. They produced an addendum in 2023 and then already updated it this year. So that gives us a little hint about what some of these ethics codes might be thinking.
And for listeners who are not familiar with that acronym, will you break that one down? The organization that has been better in defining more rapidly use of AI in clinical practice.
American Mental Health Counselors Association.
That's so interesting to me that you have one group of professionals in an organization that has gone headlong into this and is already defining and updating, and then you have another that has yet to mention it. And I think the complication for mental health professionals is like, who do you listen to? Who do you follow? Particularly if one of if you're one of the clinicians that hasn't had your board address it, I agree in this idea of the wild, wild west. And one of the things that I've said before is sometimes when it comes to ethical guidelines, there's kind of this idea that you're driving on the Autobahn and you don't know what the speed limit is, but you could get pulled over for going the wrong speed limit. And it's like, but I don't know what it is. Like, how can I prepare? And I appreciate what you're saying. Like, this is evolving. So in that vein, what in the world do we do about it if there isn't very clear guidance?
Yeah, and I think with a lot of things with ethics, we tend to, my experience is that therapists tend to be an anxious group of people, right? And so we'll overthink things and we get worked up and we work one another up and kind of create these worst case scenarios in our head. But if you attend any good ethics training, what are they talking to you about? They're talking to you about principles, and that these are principles you consider. They're never rules. They're never rules to follow. And a lot of us want rules to follow. And this comes up all the time when we talk about clinical documentation, right? All of the ethics codes are super generic and they say document, write progress notes. And we're like, what does that mean? What's in them? And they say, I don't know, figure it out. Because it depends based on your situation, based on your license, based on your state, based on the client, based on the location where you're working. All those things impact how you might write a progress note, right? So our ethics codes are good in that way because they are not limiting us. They are giving us as much guidance as possible without saying we know every possible scenario you might ever have, because they can't. So in this way, it's always goes back to looking at the principle of what is the main principle of our ethics codes, and it's do no harm. Do no harm to our client. So thinking with that in mind, when I look at these AI tools, what we get excited about, or what I've noticed a lot of clinicians get excited about with these AI tools, is this can save me time. This can save me effort. This will do this work for me, thank God. But that is not the same as do no harm for my clients. And unfortunately, in this realm, while we are going to talk about how you can use it ethically, I do think there are ways you can use it ethically use AI ethically for a variety of things in your private practice, in any mental health clinical setting. But your intention has to be about benefiting the client. And any ethics investigation, any ethics training is always going to be about benefiting the client. That's what our ethics codes are for. So making sure that is top of mind.
I appreciate you pointing that out because you're right. I think typically, if you ask practitioners what their least favorite part of their job is, clinical documentation is almost always what you hear. So something that could reduce our stress, reduce our time is very appetizing. And I also appreciate the direction about yes and how about how it benefits a client. I appreciate that guidance. I am, I will label myself, I am not particularly familiar with AI. Some clinicians are light years ahead of me in understanding it and using it. For the people like me who go, what is this magic that this person is talking about? Can you explain how clinicians might be using AI in clinical practice and what we're really talking about, and like what does that even look like? Like I said, it's like my little joke about like a little alien that's going to come type for you. For people who have never seen this before in action, what does it actually mean to use AI?
Yeah, it could mean logging into ChatGPT and asking it to curate a list of emergency mental health resources in your area, in your county. Maybe you do virtual telehealth, and you are in a state like California that's huge, and so you can see someone in Eureka, even though you live in San Diego, but you are light years away and you have no idea what the resources up there in Eureka are. You can use AI to help guide you and say, curate this list for me, instead of having to go online and spend an hour researching yourself. You can use AI to create a list of treatment goals. You could use AI to create a treatment plan template, a progress note template. You could use AI to create meditations for your clients. You could use AI to create a list of educational resources on parenting, on a specific diagnosis, so many things. Another thing you could use AI to do is write your progress notes. So what does that look like? There are a few different ways that AI can do that. And typically you log into a system, a platform, and there are many, actually, even though this is so new. There are like 10 that I could think of off the top of my head, and still ones that I find out about on a weekly basis. But you log into a platform and you provide it information about your session. You might do that by actually conducting the session on that platform, as you would in any other telehealth video session. You might do that by uploading a recording of your session. You might do that by typing in a summary of your session or typing in notes, or you might speak to it and dictate notes to it to give a summary of the session. And not all of them work in the same way, but in general, that's how you would give information to these platforms. And then they interpret the data and give you a progress note. Some of them are working on treatment plans as well, and intake assessments, and all kinds of things. But progress notes is definitely the most common one, and where most of these platforms seem to have started. And we'll get into how well they write progress notes and what you need to look at and what you need to do beforehand and all of that. But those are some of the common ways I see people using AI in clinical practice.
Thank you. It seems to me, in thinking about the list that you just provided, the big caveat here seems like it's about review. So I could see the issue being that someone uses this tool by saying, yes, can you give me a list of all the adolescent mental health facilities within this zip code? And then we save that as a PDF, and then we send it to the person requesting that referral list, without doing our homework to make sure that those facilities are real and that they're open and that they're accepting clients and all of that. You're smiling and nodding. Can you speak to that piece of it?
Yes. So here's the thing with AI. It is not human intelligence, meaning sometimes it doesn't do a great job of, whether that's the directive you give it, because it's only as good as the information you provide to it or you tell it that you want, or whether that's bad information on the internet. We all know not everything on the internet's not true. All these AI platforms are using information from the internet. So that means it might be curating data that is incorrect or wrong or never existed, but that someone made up. For example, if you're familiar with The Onion, it's a satirical news outlet, and AI doesn't know it's a satirical news outlet. So it has sometimes included The Onion as a reference for certain things. So that's an example of how AI can go wrong. AI also hallucinates. So AI platforms in general want to provide you the information you ask for, even if that information does not exist. So that's when you hear people talk about hallucinations, that's what they mean. AI is making information up. And so, as you said, if you ask it for a reference list of adolescent clinics in this zip code, number one, you still need to check that that's accurate information. So maybe the number has changed, the phone number has been updated, or an email address or contact information has been updated, but AI didn't know that. It pulled information from that's older. Maybe it made something up because it wanted to give you, because you asked for 5 references or 3 resources, and there's only 2, but you asked for 3, so it's going to make up the third one. Maybe it's giving you information from another zip code, but someone typed that in wrong somewhere. And so there are a variety of things. So while that information is super helpful and is probably easier than just Googling and creating a whole list yourself, you always have to check it. Always, 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 for accuracy. And I can speak more specifically about ways that AI has been inaccurate in progress notes. And this is across the board, regardless of the platform. And for some that I have found to be really good, it's never that they're not perfect, it's that they've always made a mistake. So I think you and I, with clinical documentation, my goal is never to teach people to be perfect. There's no such thing. But it has always made a mistake, and that's different. That's the thing that you always have to review to catch.
As we continue this conversation about the use of AI with clinical documentation, knowing that you've been a clinical documentation trainer for such a long time, what do you believe the purpose of clinical documentation is?
I don't think there's one purpose. I think it's multiple. So one is for record keeping for clients, for continuity of care, for whatever they might need it for. Thinking of ourselves as clients, there are simply times we need our records for different reasons, and they can, help or harm us. But regardless, there are times we need that. The other is for clinical quality. And on the clinician end, being able to check up on things you've done, being able to review things, looking back over what may have worked, what may not have worked, what you've done. If you see 25 clients in a week and you're doing that consistently, you can tell me you have a wonderful memory, but I know from looking at people's records, you don't remember what happened a year ago in a session on September 17th. And that's normal. That's okay. But that's another thing that records can do, right? Is they can offer us as clinicians that information. And I found them very helpful when I was seeing clients to go back and review records. And sometimes we get stuck in the week by week, right? We get stuck in not even the crisis of the week, but just the ongoing work. And it's helpful to go back and reflect on where people have come from and all the work we've done with them. And if you don't have that documented in a whatever way you might do that, it can be difficult to remember how much we have done with people. Then there's also legal requirements. So it is a legal and ethical requirement to document, and there's insurance. So insurance needs to check up on things. So there might be payers or other people who are involved who aren't always malicious in their intent, but there are those other reasons for documenting as well.
Thank you. As we proceed with this conversation, I appreciate you outlining those points because I think they're grounding of why am I writing this note? What is the purpose of this note? What is the purpose of these 10 notes or of this chart that I might be handing over to the court system, let's say? So that review, I think, is helpful context. Let's take a moment and dive a little bit more into the conversation about law and ethics and specifically talk about AI as it relates to HIPAA.
Yeah, because that will always come up.
Yes.
So HIPAA, again, gives us guidance and some legal standards and mandates around how to manage information and technology. And I'm not an attorney. I'm talking very generally here, right? But there are a couple of things with HIPAA that are very specific and very easy to apply with AI. So number one is this whole concept of 18 identifiers. And so we all know that PHI, personal health information, HIPAA talks about this. And this is a big thing for therapists. We're really good at confidentiality. We're also really good at manipulating these 18 identifiers that HIPAA actually identifies when we want to be able to share client information. So how that works with notes specifically is that people say, oh, well, I've de-identified the data, so I can log in and give the information on what happened in this session, but the information is de-identified, so I can use this technology platform and not worry about whether or not it's HIPAA compliant. I'm being HIPAA compliant because I've de-identified the data. We just reviewed the purpose of documentation. It is impossible to de-identify data and produce a quality, accurate progress note. Those do not coexist because de-identifying data is more than just taking out someone's name. We know that we could still talk circles around a lot of specifics of someone and still identify them. And if you're giving a platform enough information for it to write a progress note for you, you are giving it personal health information. If you are giving it information about someone's diagnosis and about how they are diagnosed or about their symptoms, and maybe it meant also in that session you mentioned something that could identify their location or where they are, it's just too difficult to guarantee that you're not adding personal health information. So this is my opinion. I've talked with attorneys about this. I've talked with other people who are experts in the field all tend to agree. You cannot write a progress note without using personal health information. So that's one. That doesn't mean you can't use AI to write a progress note. What's the other part of HIPAA that a lot of us are familiar with, which is a BAA, a business associate agreement. So if you use an EHR, if you use any technology platform, for that platform to be, for you to use it in a HIPAA secure way, you need to get a BAA, a business associate agreement with that company. It's usually really easy. So if you have an electronic health record, you usually, when you create your login and sign up, it'll prompt you to download the BAA and it gives you all the information. You have it, boom. That's step one in being HIPAA secure on your end as the user. Same thing with writing progress notes. So if you want to use AI to write progress notes, you can, but you need to use a system that will give you a BAA. And the thing is, there are plenty of them out there. There's no reason not to use one because there are at least 10 I could name right now that exist. So let's be very clear that ChatGPT is not one of those entities. And if you try to use ChatGPT to write a progress note, it will actually give you a notice informing you that this is not a platform where you should enter personal health information. And it has a bunch of, because I've tested ChatGPT on fake scenarios a bunch of times, it has multiple little warnings it will give you. But it is not, in my opinion, ethical or compliant in any way to use ChatGPT for client progress notes, client treatment plans, client-specific information. And there are lots of other platforms available where you can do that and be compliant with HIPAA.
You had mentioned a business associate agreement. If a clinician keeps paper records that are locked up in their filing cabinet, and then they sign on for a service that's not ChatGPT to use AI to make progress notes, what does the creation and agreement for a BAA look like with that company?
Typically, it'll be very similar to anyone who signed up for an EHR. You log in, you create your account, and it prompts you right away to download the BAA. If you use Google Drive, Google Workspace, you might be familiar with the fact that it doesn't always prompt you. So I'm not guaranteeing that if you use any of these AI companies that it's going to prompt you, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's not HIPAA compliant, but you would have to ask. You as the user and as the clinician are not compliant with HIPAA until you acquire the BAA. That's your requirement. Because it's sort of like your way of guaranteeing this company has said that they meet certain standards and criteria, and they are giving me a legal document to show me that. So you as the clinician don't have to go and do all this research and know all these technical terms to determine which company might be the best suited technology-wise, right? It's kind of this understood agreement. As long as you're able to download a BAA and they give it to you, you can know that they meet the minimum standards for security related to HIPAA.
I definitely want to come back to using AI for progress notes. I want to take a quick jaunt over into plugins. So many, if not all, clinicians use email, and many clinicians may email with clients. So, is our email server secure? Who has access to it? How do we protect it? What passwords? What are our protections? By the way, we have CE content relating to that. So please feel free to look at those courses. But I'm thinking about these AI plugins that are now offered for any number of email servers that you can download something and you get a long email, and then you can hit a button now within your email to construct a response, and then you hit send. But in doing so, let's pretend it's a client who emails you and says, this thing happened with my coach and I want to talk about it. And now I've noticed that my insomnia has gotten worse and I had 2 flashbacks yesterday relating to blah, 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 blah. And now AI has access to all that information. There are far reaching implications here beyond just talking to a bot about a progress note. And what happens if we give any of these companies basically free reign within things like email?
Absolutely. Yeah. And any technology, and it is so pervasive in our life and so useful that it can be difficult to remember these things. You might very, with very good intentions, right, download that plugin and not think twice about it. So it doesn't mean that you're like a bad clinician if you do these things, or if you're like, oh my gosh, I just did something like that. And let's also be clear that it is not necessarily unethical to email with clients either. That's all, based on how you're managing that. And one of the big issues here is informed consent, which will definitely talk about that as well. But you as the clinician, it is on you to check up on those things and think about, okay, you're hearing this now. Did I download something recently? Let me go check on that. Did I download a BAA with that? Do they have an agreement? Do they guarantee this? And essentially, and I will say this is unfortunate that I need to share this, but there are companies who say they are HIPAA compliant and then they don't have a BAA to give you. That means they are not. That means you are not HIPAA compliant using them. So you must have that BAA. That is your security that this company is doing what they're telling you they are going to do to keep client data secure. And like I said, there's so many options available that there's no need to do something that's not secure. And it's do a little bit of an audit with yourself. So if you're thinking about that now, take this moment, hit pause or do whatever you got to do and check, do I have a BAA for this? Keep them in a folder so that it's easy for you to reference, like in a folder on your computer, a BAA folder, and make sure that all of the different technologies that you're using, you have a BAA for them. And it's okay if you don't, then just stop using it now. It doesn't mean that it has to be a huge crisis or a really big deal. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a HIPAA breach. Again, I'm not like an attorney on HIPAA, but I would say just from now on, do the best that you can.
Diving into informed consent in the example that you just gave, because I can completely see that. Like I can totally see a clinician being like, this is handy. And these emails are constructed. I can also see that from an administrative perspective, that you have someone who's a clinic manager that is using that to create memos and it's within their email. And then it's like, oh, that means that anytime a client's emailed me and I've replied, now it has access to that too. From an informed consent standpoint, is there an obligation to reach out to that client or to those clients and say that your information may have been exposed as a result of using this service?
I would say yes. I mean, there's no law I can point you to on this, right? But the AMHCA, who did provide some guidance on how to use AI in clinical practice, they say that you must obtain informed consent before you can use AI with clients. And so I like to think of it as kind of two broad pools. So you have, or areas, right? So you have general clinic practices or clinical resources or clinical tools, and then you have client information. So anytime you dive into the client information pool, you have to have that BAA and you have to have informed consent. So for example, if you're going to use AI to write progress notes, even if you are doing it after the fact, you're using the option where I said maybe you dictate to the system after you have had a session, or you type in some notes to the platform after your session, you must have informed consent. And if we look at, again, those general ethical principles, this is a new realm. And so all of our ethical guidelines speak to how do you use these new things that come up. And they all say that we have to inform our clients that this is new, this is not researched, or whatever the limitations are with it. and make sure that they're informed before they get involved. And so that is really, really key. But it is related to client information. So like your email example is a really great one. I would not copy paste a client's email into ChatGPT and ask ChatGPT for a response because ChatGPT is not HIPAA compliant. However, you could use ChatGPT to say, hey, I'm a therapist in this state. You could give it all. The more information you give any of these platforms, the better results you'll get. You could give it all the information about your practice and then say, can you formulate a welcome email for me after I acquire a new client? So you could use it to create your general email templates that you then send to all of your clients. But that's more of like a practice policy thing than an email to an individual about that individual.
The topic of informed consent has some myths that float around. For example, is this a formal document that needs to be signed? Or does it need to be updated? Can you speak a little bit about that to clarify really what informed consent means? Also, as I ask this question, I want to make note that what is acceptable in one jurisdiction may not be in another. So as Dr. McCaffrey answers this question, to keep in mind any of us needing to know what is going on in the states where we practice and the states where we have clients.
Exactly. So the answer will vary based on where you are and what license you have. But applying to all of us, informed consent is a process, first and foremost, meaning it's something you discuss with people at the outset of therapy and it's ongoing. So it's not just something you review with people in the first session, and it's not a form that you have people sign. It is an actual process of informing people of what therapy means and of the limitations, benefits of therapy, and anything else that may be relevant. Then it is an ongoing process of continuing to inform as needed based on what might be going on. So limitations to confidentiality is a big part of a lot of our informed consent process that you might have to bring up with people multiple times. Other policies might be, or discussing things about the relationship of the therapist and establishing boundaries. These are all parts of informed consent. And how AI would fall into that is that you're informing them, I would like to use this tool. It can help me professionally, and it might actually help us. It might pick out some things from our sessions that I wouldn't because, I'm a human and I make mistakes and I also have bias. And so there are some potential benefits of using this. It's also very new, and I can't guarantee that, I can guarantee to you that I will check up on it and that all of your notes will be reviewed by me and signed by me and edited by me. But you might have some limitations as far as what it's going to do and what it might look like in the future. And you inform clients as best you can. Most of these platforms do have a form that you could download and have clients sign. So it's still wild, wild west enough that there's no requirement, for AI that you have to have an informed consent for AI. The way like some states do require that for telehealth now, for example. So that might be in the future. But as far as I know, that's not a mandate anywhere at this point. But there are options. And even if you don't have them sign a specific form, and this is, I think, what you're getting at with the informed consent documents too, in general, you may not have to have clients sign a form, but you do have to document getting informed consent. And I would absolutely recommend doing that related to AI. As soon as you start using it for any client records, document at the very least that you reviewed with them, the potential limitations and uses of AI, and that the client consented to the use of AI. Related to that, it's still new enough. You could not tell someone, I am really struggling with administrative work, and this AI system is going to help me dramatically. And I've started using it with other clients, and it's saving me hours a week. So this is my new practice policy. I use this AI for all progress notes. And then you tell that to your client and they say, I don't like that. Actually, I don't want you to use AI. Based on all the ethics guidelines I've reviewed, I would say AI is still new enough that you could not tell someone, no, I can't see you because this is my new practice policy. It's not a standard. AI is definitely not a standard, right? There are other policies where you could say, potentially, you could potentially say that refuse to see someone initially, like this is part of my policy, this is what I do. They say that doesn't work for me, and you say, well, I have some referrals for you. Like this may not be a good fit how we work together. You cannot do that with AI. You need to get your client's consent for it, and if they say no, you have to respect that and continue seeing them.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing up that particular point. On the flip side, the other thing that occurred to me, and I know I've certainly seen this, particularly in larger health systems, this big old stack of paperwork. So in order to begin care here, you need to sign here, 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 here. And then a client is handed one of those little electronic signature pads, and they may not actually be reading, and in all probability are not reading that. If we're looking at informed consent as a process where someone is knowingly consenting, if we just roll this in to a stack of paperwork that isn't actually discussed, it seems to me that then we would be outside the spirit of the expectation because the client doesn't necessarily know that they've consented.
Absolutely. And interesting little sidebar. I have, in a nerdy way, done extensive research on board complaints and board investigations because that's all open source data. And I have seen boards. This was a board specifically in California, but again, you can extrapolate a lot of these things to this is not beyond the realm of possibility for most of us. I have seen them tell clinicians, yes, you have an informed consent document signed by this client, and it does not appear you actually got informed consent. A signature is not good enough. They literally have that. So I think like that for me really hit home where when I train on documentation, I teach people, yes, obviously, in some places you do need an actual document signed. It doesn't mean don't get the document signed. And I do think it can be a helpful process to have your processes written out and have people sign that, even if it's not a requirement. However, also review it with people. The common things, you don't have to read your 6-page document word for word, but review the basic concepts and principles and the important things that can often lead to people being confused or unhappy about the clinical relationship. Those are the things I would encourage people to focus on. So if you breach confidentiality for some reason, that can have a big impact on the clinical relationship. Make sure people know what might lead to that, right? So think through those kind of scenarios when you're thinking through, well, what part of my informed consent process should I make sure people are aware of at the outset? And then when things come up, you review it again.
Thank you. And also I'd imagine if you have an existing relationship and then decide, okay, I want to start using AI, then we need to do that whole process again. And if they're going to sign the informed consent document that may have it rolled in, great, but then also best practice to actually have that conversation and say, this is what I'm intending to do. And I think the important thing that you also highlighted there was the consent, where it's what we're asking is this okay with you? Not this is what I'm doing. And it's this unilateral statement.
Exactly. And that's where, 10 years from now, that might be different. I don't know. But right now, it's still new enough that I think it deserves its own space in that process, and it deserves its own time that you inform people about it, separate from all the other things.
Yeah. Yeah. You had mentioned some of the benefits and potential pitfalls, specifically of using AI for progress notes. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Obvious benefit that a lot of people first speak to is time. So, this is going to save me time. I think that's the first thing that most clinicians think. I am going to burst your bubble and tell you that it usually doesn't. Partly because if you have used ChatGPT and you're one of these people who's super excited about AI, and I'm excited about AI too, but if you're like, I'm on board, let me test this stuff. ChatGPT is super fast. I mean, or Gemini or any of these other more common generic open source platforms. You can have almost a conversation with it like you're texting with someone else. It will answer you in real time. It's very quick. None of these AI progress note platforms are like that. I'm talking you give it the information and then you go and get a coffee, you go and do another session, and 15, 20 minutes later, you get your progress note. So don't think that you're going to log in, type in a few things, and then boom, get a progress note. That's not how any of these systems that I have tested out works. So there's that. And then there's the time of reviewing it. So let's talk about the reasons why you have to review it. It can be really tempting to see it. And here's the side benefit a lot of clinicians, when they first start testing AI progress note generators, say, it writes a better progress note than I did. It writes a better progress note than I ever could. So most people, I think, jump in with the time management thing, and then that's their first impression. It sounds so good. It sounds so clinical. I mentioned I have not seen one yet that didn't make a mistake. So it might sound clinical if you just gloss over it, but I have seen it make up client quotes that you think would be really easy for the AI to suss out, but it didn't. I have seen it. Here's a great example of nuance. I uploaded a session with Carl Rogers, where he's the therapist. And if you've ever seen any Carl Rogers sessions, he's the therapist we all want, right? He's so nice. He's so great. And yet he leads you to these profound insights. And he reflects back what the client said, which is something about you're afraid your daughter won't like you. And that's not the exact quote. I wish I could remember the exact quote, but what he reflects back, he's simply reflecting back what she says. When you're watching the session, it feels very natural and it's very impactful. The way AI did it was it said the therapist pointed out to the client that her daughter would not like her if she knew the real her. That's what it was. Her daughter would not like her if she knew the real her. So AI can't pick up on the nuance of the client simply reflecting back a thought that the client had, and then the client, being able to further process. So that's another thing. It wasn't inaccurate, technically, in the way it was writing the note, but none of us would have written that. And of course, we know we should take that out if we saw that. So there are things like that where, unless you're reading it, actually reading the document, you would not necessarily know to take that out. There are other things that I've seen these different progress note generators do that are a little bit more obvious, where like it calls someone by the wrong name, or it adds in people that weren't there, or where it makes up interventions that happened. Or there are times, again, using Carl Rogers as an example, where it really accurately reflects what he did in the session. And if you work with insurance, it doesn't have good active interventions that an insurance company might want to see. So it's not written in a way that would stand up to audits from certain insurance companies. So all of those require a clinician to review it and potentially edit it.
And therein lies where someone may not be saving time.
Exactly. Now, I will say I've heard from therapists who have told me, thank you for reviewing this AI platform. I started using it, and multiple people have used the words life-changing. So that doesn't mean it doesn't work for certain people, but it's just something to remember that it's not necessarily going to save you time. It will require you to likely restructure how you write notes or your process of writing notes. I will say, if it takes you the same amount of time, but it takes off some of that mental load of writing progress notes, I think that could still be really beneficial, even if it doesn't save you time. If you feel less stressed out about your progress notes, great. I think the most beneficial way to use it is probably, if you do a lot of telehealth sessions, logging in, using a platform where you can log in. And so it's listening into the session as you're doing the session, and then producing the note for you afterwards, because then you're not doing any additional work of having to provide it the information. But not all of them do that, and not all clients want to consent to that level of you using AI, and not all of us are doing telehealth all the time either. So it doesn't always make it as easy.
To me, those imagining myself as a client, it would be two different things for a clinician to use AI to refine language, let's say, and a different thing if a session is effectively being recorded word for word, and then that's used to create what becomes a progress note. And I think that loops back to your point about informed consent. And it sounds like in the absence of clear guidance from many of these boards, your recommendation is to err on the side of caution and err on the side of CYA, for lack of a better term, and also for the client's sake, to be really blunt, because I could see how it would be so damaging if you're seeing somebody for a year and a half, you've been recording every session. I mean, maybe not you, but the AI tool that you've been using in your telehealth sessions has been recording everything. And then somehow you mention that and the client says, "Excuse me?"
Oh, absolutely.
And I mean, before we started recording, Melissa and I were talking about, many of us are really creeped out by the things that our phones or computers know about us and what can be recorded and what information is gleaned by the way that we engage with technology. And that can be really eerie. And I can see how it could affect rapport for clients to not know that that's what's happening with their information.
And I will say it also gets into record keeping and what is the record. So most of these AI progress note generators, it's a separate platform, one that you're paying for, which because they are being HIPAA secure, it's worth paying for if you want to use one. But it's a separate platform you log into, and then typically you would copy paste the note into your electronic health record or wherever you keep your progress notes. But none of them, there is one that is a combo EHR and AI platform, but most of them are not integrated with your EHR, your electronic health record, or any record. So are you using that to store the notes? What do you do with the notes afterwards? Are you good about actually transferring them in, or do you let them sit in the progress note generator for a few weeks because administrative stuff has already been difficult for you, and that's what would happen for me. I can almost guarantee, right? As I would just kind of forget and not track that. Are you, a lot of them, if they do have the transcript, are you deleting the transcript? Does the system do that for you? They all work a little bit differently, but those are things to consider, because what I unfortunately see is going to happen is a very well-meaning clinician will have someone's informed consent and they are being super ethical and using one of these platforms. And someone will request their records and they'll say, well, you've been using that AI thing, like, don't you have more records? And that's a gray area. I don't know what's going to happen. Does that client have access to that transcript? If we look at it from a client rights perspective, I'm thinking probably yes. Like, if that case went to court, I feel like it would be very difficult to argue that someone shouldn't have access to that record if they requested it and it's their session, their personal health information. So this clinician has been ethical this whole time. And yet what happens when we don't know, when we have information in multiple locations for people? And when that information, because I know someone will be thinking, well, what about psychotherapy notes? That information is not psychotherapy notes. That is clearly related to client treatment and client progress. And I do not think anyone would consider any legal entity or in any case that would be considered psychotherapy notes. So what happens then? And that adds an extra layer of you monitoring, are these records, once I have used them, being deleted so that I don't have client information in multiple systems. Or maybe you don't use an EHR. Maybe you use a lot of paper records. You start using one of these, and that's the only place you keep them. Awesome. Are you deleting transcripts if you have transcripts? Are you deleting recordings if you have recordings, right? And also remembering that if you're recording things in some states, that's a different consent form.
To that point, that was exactly what I was thinking, that if there is a recording, because that's a method that someone is using, would we even be allowed to delete it? And these are complete gray areas, but I'm glad that you bring them up. And in the vein of thinking about transcripts, imagine how that would change family court proceeding. If instead of talking about progress notes or even a summary, depending on what state, an actual play by play of every single session that you had with a minor and what the minor statements were. And also the understanding that a transcript loses nuance. So it's just words that could have been said with sarcasm, that could have been said in different contexts that we would miss.
And on the flip side, imagine the potential benefits for supervision. So again, none of these things are always wrong or right, but it is about the context in which you're using it. And if it were in that context, you would obviously be explicit that we are going to use this. There are training programs, right? And internship programs who regularly record all sessions, and that's an ongoing part of the process. And that can be amazing. And so I could see AI being really helpful in a lot of supervision settings, actually, because you could have a little bit more data than the
therapist self-report.
supervisee is willing to give up, or just may not even recognize is important, right? So it could be really helpful. But then it goes back to letting clients know about that and still managing it. It doesn't mean that you need to always save those recordings. It doesn't, you need to have a policy around what you're doing with transcripts, what you're doing with recordings, and even what you're doing with those old progress notes in another platform before or after you then put them in an EHR or other record system.
Maelisa, you have covered so many important points in this time. And I also want to commend your forward thinking in anticipating where we might end up. So again, as I've said, we're in the middle of 2024. How is this conversation going to be different come beginning of 2028? We both have no idea. And I appreciate you for trying to imagine kind of these different outcomes, because there is that ethical concept of doing no harm and doing our best to anticipate where might this go sideways, and how do we help protect our clients and support them in the meantime. Are there any particular resources, given that a lot of this is emerging, are there any particular resources that you recommend for clinicians who are wanting to learn more about the use of AI in private practice?
Yeah, I would say, for one, keep your eye out for trainings as they become available. If you are listening to this as a training, for example, a year from now, you might need an updated one. See what someone else has to say about it, or see what I'm saying about it next year. I don't know. But, this is not something where it is not a training you can take once and then apply for the next few years. That's not the reality. Also, I do have a very extensive YouTube series on this topic, so I'm continuing to update that. And I have specific reviews of each of the progress note generators out there so that you can see. A lot of them are just like electronic health records, where maybe they're doing very similar things, but you may like one more than the other, and it's personal preference. And I talk about, I have all of them write a progress note and talk about how well they did. So you can see all of those answers. And then I also have, in that, as part of that series, some introductory videos on thinking through, is AI helping me? So if you're thinking through, I'd kind of like to try it, but I don't know, it's a quick 5 or 6 question sheet that you can ask yourself to help you determine for yourself if it's a good fit. And I call it an AI rubric. So I would recommend that as a way to start right now and to get information on some of the specific platforms if you're looking for that.
Fantastic. And again, for our listeners, Dr. Maelisa McCaffrey. And Dr. McCaffrey, for folks who just want to learn more about you and about your training, what's the best way to do that?
QAprep.com. Hopefully that's pretty easy to remember. Just head over there and you'll find out all kinds of resources. If you go to the blog, that is where we also post the videos as blog posts. So that's an easy way to kind of be able to find there, and you can search and find what you need.
Fantastic. This has been eye-opening. Thank you so much. So helpful. So many little nuggets of information that I know I'm going to hold on to and, maybe think about in the middle of the night and go, oh my gosh, what if? But thank you for joining us, Melissa. It's been lovely to have you.
Yeah, thank you.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive continuing ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.